Most people chasing old military rifles are looking in the wrong glass case. They want the famous names, the German Mauser, the M1 Garand, the Lee-Enfield. But while everyone fights over those, 3 cheaper surplus rifles are still sitting in plain sight, packed with real history, strong design, and collector upside almost nobody talks about. Number 3. The Italian Carcano M91 No. 3 is the rifle almost everybody loves to mock until they actually learn what it is. The Italian Carcano M91 for years. Collectors treated the Carcano like the weird kid at the surplus table. Too Italian, too odd, too many versions. Strange clips, strange ammo, strange sights. And because of all that, people walked right past it while chasing Mausers, Mosins, Springfields, and Garands. But that is exactly why the Carcano became one of the last cheap doors into real military rifle collecting. This rifle is not some fake historical prop. It is not a forgotten farm gun with no story behind it. The original Carcano Model 1891 served Italy through the First World War, the Second World War, colonial fighting, reserve use, police use, and decades of hard service. That means when you are looking at a Carcano, you are not looking at a random bargain bin rifle. You are looking at a military arm that stood inside some of the biggest events of the 20th century, and here is where people get it wrong. They call it weak. They call it ugly. They call it inaccurate. They talk about it like Italy issued a bad rifle for 50 years by accident. That is not how armies work. The Carcano was simple, light enough to carry, easy enough to produce, and strong enough to stay in service for generations. It used the SICK 5x52mm cartridge, which was very forward-thinking when it was adopted. At a time when many armies still loved large, heavy rounds, Italy went smaller and flatter. Was it perfect? No. No surplus rifle is. Ammo can be a problem. Clips matter. Some rifles are rough. Some have worn barrels. Some have been rebuilt so many times that the parts tell 5 different stories at once. But that is also the point. The Carcano is not one boring rifle. It is a whole family of rifles and carbines with different eras, factories, markings, wars, and details hiding inside them. That is where the gold mine starts. People ignore them because they look simple. But collectors who slow down start seeing the real game. Early long rifles. Special troops carbines, wartime production Finnish-used rifles, markings from Terni, Brescia, Beretta, and other Italian makers. Some are common. Some are much harder to find. Some are only cheap because the seller does not know what version is actually sitting on the table, and that is the best kind of surplus rifle story. Not a gun that is already famous and overpriced. A gun that still makes people shrug before they realize what they missed. The Carcano also has one thing every collector market loves: a bad reputation that is slowly being corrected. That matters. When a rifle is already loved by everyone, the easy money is gone. When a rifle is still laughed at by casual buyers, the careful people can still find value. The Carcano sits right in that strange middle zone. Too historical to stay ignored forever, but still too misunderstood to get full respect from the average buyer. That is why it belongs at number 3. It is not here because every Carcano is rare. Most are not. It is not here because every Carcano is worth big money. Many are still basic surplus rifles. It is here because the floor is still low, the history is real, and the collector story keeps getting stronger. The ignored Italian rifle is not the joke anymore. The joke is watching people pass it up because they still think it is one. Number 2. The Turkish M1938 Mauser No. 2 is the rifle that looks confusing at first, and that confusion is exactly why people ignore it. The Turkish M1938 Mauser. This is one of the messiest surplus rifle names out there. When people say Turkish M1938, they are not always talking about one clean model made one simple way. Sometimes they are talking about rebuilt older rifles. Sometimes they are talking about rifles brought up to a standard pattern. Sometimes they are talking about Kale rifles made in Turkey during World War II. That messy history scares casual collectors away. Here is the part that surprises a lot of buyers. The name Model 1938 was never an official Turkish military designation in the first place. It was a label American importers came up with later, just to give a whole mixed group of rifles one simple tag on a shelf. The Turkish army never called it that. So when someone says they own a Turkish M1938, they could be holding a rifle rebuilt from an old Gewehr 98, a Turkish 1893, a Turkish 1903, or a true K-Kale-made action, all wearing the same imported label. That single fact confuses more buyers than almost anything else in the surplus world. And honestly, that is good news for anyone who knows what they are looking at. Because under all that confusion, the Turkish Mauser is still a Mauser pattern military rifle with real service history, real steel, and real collector interest. It does not have the clean, sexy story of a German K98K. It does not have the same instant name value. It does not make people lean over the counter the same way. But that is why it can still be found for far less money. The whole story starts with Turkey trying to standardize a pile of older rifles. The country had used different Mauser designs over time, and by the 1930s, that created a problem. Different parts, different calibers, different patterns, using an older 7.65mm cartridge, then switched over to the 7.9mm round, the same 8mm Mauser that Germany used in the late 1920s. Every older rifle still chambered for the first caliber had to be reworked or retired. So Turkey began rebuilding and updating rifles into a more common form. That is why so many Turkish Mausers feel like puzzles. One rifle may carry the soul of an older action, but the look of a later rebuild to some buyers. That sounds like a negative. To collectors, it should sound like a map. Every Turkish Mauser can become a little research project. What receiver is it? Was it rebuilt? Was it made at K-Kale? Is it an older action wearing a later life? Are the marks Turkish, German, Czech, Ottoman, or scrubbed and re-stamped? Even the receiver stampings tell their own small story. Letters like TC stand for the Turkish Republic. Letters like ASFA point to the military factory that did the work. The word Ankara marks the capital where much of that work was based, and Kale points straight to the arsenal town of Kirakale, where Turkey built its own rifles instead of leaning on imports. Reading those stamps correctly is basically reading the rifle's own passport. That is the hidden value. It is not always clean, but it is rarely boring. And then there is the price. While German K98K rifles climbed into serious collector money, Turkish Mausers stayed in the cheap lane for years. Some were rough. Some had dark bores. Some had mismatched parts. Some had the kind of long, hard-used look that scares away people who only want pretty rifles. But many were still solid military rifles in 8mm Mauser, built around one of the most famous rifle systems ever made. That is why the Turkish M1938 is a goldmine in a different way, not because every single one is a safe treasure. That would be false. Some are beat up. Some are missing parts. Some need a careful inspection before anyone even thinks about using them. But as a collector's story, they are packed with value. They connect the Ottoman world, the Turkish Republic, German rifle design, local rebuild programs, and World War II-era pressure into one overlooked rifle. People ignore them because they are not pretty, but surplus collecting was never only about pretty. A rifle with worn bluing, mixed parts, and Turkish markings can still tell a better story than a polished safe queen with no soul. That is the part casual buyers miss. They want clean markings and famous names. The Turkish Mauser gives them a puzzle instead. And puzzles are where the bargains hide. The K-Kale rifles make the story even better. These were Turkish-made Mauser-type rifles from the World War II period, produced when Turkey was neutral but under pressure and forced to rely more on its own arms industry. Turkey stayed out of the fighting for almost the entire war, which means these rifles never marched into the big battles most collectors picture when they hear the words World War II. Some buyers hold that against them. It should be the opposite. A rifle built by a country trying to arm itself without leaning on either side of a world war is its own kind of history lesson. That gives the rifle a special place. It is not just another recycled Mauser. It is part of Turkey's move toward making its own military rifles. That is real history, and it is still cheaper than many rifles with less interesting stories. So yes, the Turkish M1938 Mauser is ugly to some people. It is confusing to others. It may not win the beauty contest next to a clean Swedish Mauser or a perfect Swiss K31, but that is exactly why it still belongs here. Because once a collector understands what it is, the cheap Turkish rifle suddenly stops looking cheap. It starts looking like one of the last affordable ways to own a full-power Mauser story without paying German Mauser money. Number 1. The Yugoslav M48 Mauser number 1 is the rifle that should not still be this overlooked. The Yugoslav M48 Mauser. This is where the list gets serious, because the M48 is not just cheap surplus. It is not just good for the money. It is one of the best-built surplus rifles that still gets ignored because it showed up too late for the big war story. That is the whole reason people miss it. The M48 was made after World War II. Not during the war, not in a famous battle, not carried by German troops across Europe. So a lot of collectors see it and instantly downgrade it in their mind. They want the rifle that was there in 1944. The M48 came after, so they walk away. Big mistake, because post-war does not mean low quality. In fact, the early Yugoslav M48 rifles were very well made. They used milled parts, strong Mauser-style construction, and clean military production. Yugoslavia had to rebuild after the war, and it needed a standard rifle to replace the mix of older Mausers and captured rifles it already had. The answer was the M48. Production started in 1950 at the Zastava works in the city of Kragujevac, a factory that carried its own internal code, Prejudice 44, stamped right onto the receiver in Cyrillic lettering alongside the national crest. Before the rifle was even finished, that stamp already told a story about where it came from and who built it, and the first version was no cheap stapled shortcut. That is the part people miss when they chase German markings and ignore Yugoslav ones. A nice M48 gives you the Mauser experience without the German K98K price tag. Same general family, same full-power 8mm Mauser world, same old-school bolt-action feel, but without the same collector madness attached to every marking, every code, every wartime date, and every fake stamp. That makes it a very strong gold mine, not because it is unknown. People in the surplus world know the M48. But outside the serious collector's circle, it still does not get the respect it deserves. Many buyers see Yugo Mauser and think it is a second-tier copy. That is lazy. The M48 is its own post-war Yugoslav rifle, not just a poor man's German Mauser. And condition is a huge part of the story. Many M48 rifles came into the surplus market in strong condition compared with older wartime rifles. That makes sense. A rifle made after World War II did not spend years being dragged through the same battlefields as a wartime K98K. Some saw service, some sat in storage, some were preserved much better than rifles made under the pressure of total war. So when you compare what the money buys, the M48 gets very hard to ignore. A German K98K may have more fame, but fame costs money. A rough K98K can still command serious attention because of the markings alone. Meanwhile, a cleaner M48 can offer better condition, better shooting feel, and real Mauser quality for less money. That is why it sits at number 1. It is the rifle that proves collectors sometimes pay for the story more than the steel. And if you care about the steel, the M48 starts looking like a steel. There are also different versions worth understanding. The early M48 used more milled parts. Later M48A and M48B versions added more stamped parts, like the magazine floor plate, the trigger guard, and the barrel bands, to reduce cost and speed up production. Even with those changes, the bolt and receiver, the parts that actually hold back the pressure of a fired round, stayed forged and machined to the same tight standards across every version. Oddly enough, many M48B rifles still carry the older M48A stamp on the receiver ring, since the factory never bothered updating the marking when the parts changed underneath it. That does not automatically make the later rifles bad. It just means the early full-crest M48 often gets more collector attention from people who know the difference, and that detail matters, because the casual buyer sees one rifle, Yugoslav Mauser. The smarter collector sees the exact variation, the condition, the markings, the matching parts, the stock, the bore, and the story behind it. That is how a rifle goes from ignored to valuable. Not because the whole world suddenly wakes up at once, but because serious people quietly start sorting the good ones from the average ones. That is already happening. The M48 is no longer the dirt-cheap rifle it used to be. None of these old surplus rifles are. The days of crates full of cheap military rifles sitting everywhere are mostly gone. Over 1 million of these rifles left Yugoslav factories across the whole production run, which is exactly why so many still turn up at gun shows and surplus dealers today. But compared with the famous names, the M48 still has room to be respected more than it is. And that is the real gold mine. Not a promise that every rifle will explode in price. Not a fantasy that every old gun is rare. But a simple fact: quality surplus rifles are drying up, and the M48 has the build quality, the Mauser connection, and the historical position to keep getting more attention. It may not have stormed Normandy. It may not have the dark wartime code collector's chase. It may not carry the instant drama of a German K98K. But that is why it is still within reach. The M48 is the rifle everyone ignores because it arrived after the famous war was over. And that might be the exact reason it is still one of the smartest surplus rifles left. So there you have it. 3 cheap surplus rifles that most people still walk past without thinking. The Carcano M91 gets mocked because people never learned its real story. The Turkish M1938 Mauser gets ignored because its history is messy and confusing. And the Yugoslav M48 gets pushed aside because it came after World War II, even though its build quality is much better than its reputation. That is the pattern. The rifles everyone already loves are no longer hidden. The Garands are known. The German Mausers are known. The clean Lee-Enfields are known. The easy money moved there years ago. But the ignored rifles still have room. They still have history. They still have character. They still have markings people overlook. They still have versions casual buyers do not understand. And most important, they still sit below the famous names, even while the whole surplus market keeps getting tighter. Which one would you put at number 1? Let us know in the comments below.